The whispers followed her like shadows as Ruth Olsen walked down the dusty main street of Fort Worth, Texas, her 6-month-old son Samuel bundled against her chest in a worn cotton sling. The year was 1873, and a woman alone with a child was subject to the cruelest judgments society could muster. Ruth kept her gaze forward, pretending not to hear the hushed comments that cut deeper than any knife could. "Shameful, absolutely shameful," muttered Mrs. Abernathy from the porch of the general store, not bothering to lower her voice as Ruth passed. "Wonder which cowpoke left her with that burden," replied her companion with a sniff. Ruth adjusted her threadbare shawl, pulling it tighter around her shoulders and the baby. 3 months in Fort Worth and the whispers hadn't quieted. If anything, they'd grown louder. She'd arrived on the stagecoach last spring, 7 months pregnant with nothing but a small trunk of belongings and determination hard as Texas bedrock. Now, struggling to make ends meet as a seamstress at Mrs. Holloway's dress shop, she faced the daily gauntlet of judgment from a town that had decided her worth before knowing her story. Samuel stirred against her chest, his tiny fist working free from his blanket. She touched his soft cheek with a finger calloused from endless hours of needlework. "It's just you and me, little one," she whispered. "Don't you mind them." Ruth turned the corner toward the dress shop, nearly colliding with a tall man in a worn leather vest and dusty boots. She stumbled backward, clutching Samuel protectively. "Beg your pardon, madam," the stranger said, his voice deep but gentle. His hand had instinctively moved to steady her elbow, then quickly withdrawn when she'd righted herself. "No harm done," Ruth replied quietly, eyes cast downward as she tried to move past. "Your boy all right?" He asked, causing her to pause in surprise. Most men in town pretended not to notice Samuel, as if her child were evidence of a crime best ignored. Ruth looked up then, really seeing the stranger for the first time. His face was tanned by the sun, with crow's feet at the corners of eyes that regarded her without judgment. A few days' growth of beard shadowed his jawline, and beneath his wide-brimmed hat, she caught a glimpse of sandy hair with hints of copper. "He's fine, thank you," she answered, unconsciously standing straighter. "Good day to you." The man touched the brim of his hat. "Madam." He moved past her, continuing down the street. Ruth watched him for a moment before turning toward the dress shop. She'd never seen him before, but Fort Worth was growing rapidly with the cattle drives and the promise of the railroad. New faces appeared daily, most passing through on their way to somewhere else, somewhere better. Inside the shop, Mrs. Holloway looked up from her ledger. "You're late, Ruth." "I'm sorry, Mrs. Holloway. Samuel was fussy this morning." The older woman pursed her lips but said nothing more. She'd given Ruth work when no one else would, and while not openly warm, she wasn't unkind. "There's a pile of mending waiting, and Mrs. Davidson is coming at noon for a fitting of her daughter's wedding dress." Ruth nodded, untying the sling and laying Samuel in the small basket she kept behind the counter. He blinked up at her with eyes the color of cornflowers, his father's eyes. She pushed the thought away and reached for her thimble and thread. The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of needle and fabric. Ruth's fingers worked deftly, her mind temporarily freed from worry as she lost herself in the precise stitches of her craft. Samuel slept peacefully, waking only once for feeding, which Ruth did discreetly in the back room while Mrs. Holloway minded the front. Just before noon, the bell above the door jingled. Ruth looked up from her work to see 3 women enter Mrs. Davidson, her daughter Claire, and Mrs. Abernathy from the general store. Ruth's stomach tightened. "Mrs. Holloway," called Mrs. Davidson, "we're here for Claire's fitting." Mrs. Holloway emerged from the back room, all smiles for her affluent customers. "Of course, right on time. Ruth has the dress ready in the fitting room." Ruth retrieved the gown from where it hung beneath a protective cloth. The white satin gleamed in the sunlight from the window, delicate pearl beadwork catching the light. She'd worked on it for weeks, sewing late into the night by lamplight after Samuel had fallen asleep. "I hope you'll forgive me," Mrs. Davidson said to Mrs. Holloway, her voice carrying clearly across the shop, but I'm a bit concerned about having her work on Claire's wedding gown. It seems somewhat inappropriate given her situation." The words froze Ruth in place, the beautiful dress draped over her arms. Mrs. Holloway hesitated, clearly torn between defending her employee and pleasing an important customer. "Ruth is our finest seamstress. It's the principle of the matter," interrupted Mrs. Abernathy. "A fallen woman handling a pure bride's wedding dress. It's simply not proper." Claire, the bride, looked uncomfortable, her gaze darting between her mother and Ruth, but she said nothing. Samuel chose that moment to wake, his small cry piercing the tense silence. Ruth felt her face burn with humiliation as she laid the dress carefully on the counter. "I'll fetch Mrs. Wilson to assist with the fitting," Mrs. Holloway said quickly, referring to her other, older, and respectably widowed seamstress who came in on busier days. Ruth retreated to Samuel, lifting him from his basket. "I'll take him outside until he settles," she said quietly to Mrs. Holloway, who nodded with a mixture of relief and apology in her eyes. The spring day that had seemed merely cool earlier now felt bitterly cold as Ruth stepped outside with Samuel. She walked a short distance from the shop, gently bouncing her son to quiet him, tears of anger and shame burning behind her eyes. She refused to let them fall. "Your boy's got quite a set of lungs." The voice startled her. The stranger from earlier was leaning against the hitching post a few feet away, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette. "He's just hungry," Ruth replied defensively. The man straightened, dropping the cigarette and grinding it out with his boot heel. "Didn't mean nothing by it, just making conversation." He studied her face. "You all right, madam?" "I'm perfectly fine," she said stiffly, though her voice betrayed her. He nodded slowly, not believing her but not pressing either. "Name's Finn Ironwood," he said, touching the brim of his hat. "Just rode in yesterday with a cattle drive from San Antonio." Ruth hesitated. "Ruth Olsen," she finally replied, "and this is Samuel." Finn stepped closer, peering at the baby with undisguised curiosity. Samuel had stopped crying and was regarding the stranger with equal interest, his tiny fingers reaching toward the man's beard. "He's a fine-looking boy," Finn said with a smile that transformed his weathered face. "Got your chin, I reckon." The simple, kind observation so different from the town's usual remarks made Ruth's throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you," she managed. A commotion down the street drew their attention. A wagon had overturned, spilling crates across the road. Horses reared and people scattered. "Better see if they need help," Finn said, already moving toward the accident. He paused, looking back at her. "Nice meeting you, Mrs. Olsen, and you too, little Samuel." Ruth watched him join the men riding the wagon, his strength evident as he lifted a corner that two others had been struggling with. There was something about him that stood apart from the other cowboys who passed through Fort Worth, a steadiness, perhaps. A certainty in his movements that spoke of a man who knew his own mind. She returned to the shop, once the fitting was well underway, slipping in through the back door to resume her work on other projects. Mrs. Holloway approached her quietly later, as the customers were leaving. "I'm sorry about that, Ruth," she said, keeping her voice low. "Mrs. Davidson is one of our best customers." "I understand," Ruth replied, though the sting remained. "It's not your doing." Mrs. Holloway hesitated. "There's talk of the new schoolhouse being finished by autumn. They'll need someone to clean it and tend to it. The pay wouldn't be much, but it might be easier than working so publicly." The implication was clear. Ruth's presence was becoming a liability to the dress shop. She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. That evening, Ruth walked home to the small room she rented above the livery stable. It wasn't ideal, with the noise and smells of horses below, but the stable owner, Mr. Jenkins, was a widower who kept to himself and charged less than she'd pay elsewhere. More importantly, he didn't ask questions when she'd arrived in town visibly pregnant and alone. The setting sun cast long shadows across the street as she approached the stable. To her surprise, Finn Ironwood was there, talking with Mr. Jenkins as they examined a chestnut mare. Mr. Jenkins spotted her first. "Evening, Mrs. Olsen. This fella's looking to board his horse while he's in town." Finn turned, hat in hand. "Mrs. Olsen," he nodded. "Fine evening." "Mr. Ironwood," she acknowledged, shifting Samuel in her arms. The baby was growing heavier by the day. "How long you planning to stay in Fort Worth?" Mr. Jenkins asked Finn, returning to their business. "Not sure yet," Finn replied. "Got some matters to attend to that might take a while. A few weeks at least." Ruth continued to her stairs at the side of the building, aware of Finn's eyes following her. She wasn't used to being truly seen by anyone in this town. Most people either stared openly with judgment or deliberately looked away. His gaze felt different, though she couldn't say exactly how. Later, after putting Samuel down in the wooden crate lined with blankets that served as his crib, Ruth sat by her small window. From there, she could see a sliver of the stable yard below, where Finn was unsaddling his horse. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard work, speaking softly to the animal as he brushed its coat in long, careful strokes. She wondered what matters had brought him to Fort Worth, and why the thought of him staying a few weeks made her heart beat just a little faster. Foolish, she chided herself. A man like that any man really was the last thing she needed in her complicated life. The next day dawned bright and clear. It was Saturday, and though the dress shop was open in the morning, Ruth had the afternoon free. She decided to take Samuel to the small park near the edge of town, away from the busiest streets and judgmental eyes. The park was little more than a patch of grass with a few trees, but it offered respite from the dusty streets and cramped quarters of her room. Ruth spread a blanket on the ground and placed Samuel on his stomach. He'd recently learned to push himself up on his arms, his little face beaming with pride at this accomplishment. "Look at you," Ruth cooed. "Such a strong boy. He's growing like a weed," came a now familiar voice. Ruth looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. Finn Ironwood stood a few feet away, hat in hand. "Mr. Ironwood," she said, surprised. "You seem to appear everywhere I go," he smiled, the expression crinkling the corners of his eyes. "Pure chance, Mrs. Olsen." "I was just taking a walk to get the lay of the town." He gestured to the empty space on her blanket. "May I?" Ruth hesitated, then nodded. Fort Worth wasn't large, but it was public enough that sitting with a man in the park wouldn't cause too much additional scandal. Besides, her reputation could hardly get worse. Finn settled beside her, his long legs stretched out, boots crossed at the ankles. He wore simple clothing, a faded blue shirt, worn denim pants, and a leather vest that had seen better days. But everything was clean, and he'd clearly made an effort to wash the trail dust from his face and hands. Samuel immediately took interest in the newcomer, attempting to crawl toward Finn with determined if uncoordinated movements. "He's friendly," Finn observed, gently extending a finger for Samuel to grab. The baby latched onto it with surprising strength. "Too friendly sometimes," Ruth admitted. "He doesn't know to be wary of strangers yet." Finn raised an eyebrow. "And should he be wary of me, Mrs. Olsen?" The directness of the question caught her off guard. I don't know, should he be?" Finn looked her in the eye. "No, madam, I'm many things, not all of them good, but I've never been a danger to women or children." There was something in his steady gaze that made Ruth believe him, despite her hard-earned caution. "How old is the little fella?" Finn asked, returning his attention to Samuel, who was now attempting to put Finn's finger in his mouth. 6 months next Tuesday," Ruth answered, watching the interaction with a mixture of wariness and something softer she couldn't name. "Good age," Finn nodded. "Starting to show his personality." He smiled as Samuel made a gurgling sound of agreement. Ruth studied Finn's face as he played with her son. Most men avoided even looking at Samuel, as if an infant born outside marriage was somehow contagious. "You're not from around here," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No, madam, born in Missouri, but I've been moving around since the war." "Drove cattle up from Texas to Kansas, worked ranches from New Mexico Territory to Colorado," he shrugged. "Never stayed in one place too long." And now you're in Fort Worth, Ruth observed. For some matters that need attending to, Finn smiled, clearly noting her curiosity. That's right. Nothing mysterious, just looking for some land to buy, thinking of settling down. Ruth couldn't hide her surprise. A cowboy looking to settle down, that's unusual. Been on the move 15 years, he said, a shadow crossing his face briefly. Gets tiresome after a while. Always being a stranger, never having a place that's yours. He looked at her directly. Reckon you might understand something about that. She did more than he knew. Since leaving home at 18, running from a stepfather whose attentions had turned dangerous after her mother's death, Ruth had drifted from town to town. Fort Worth was just the latest stop, though Samuel's arrival had forced her to pause her wandering. The land around here is good, she said, deflecting the personal turn of the conversation. Water's reliable and the railroad's coming. Finn nodded. That's what they say. Prices are going up fast because of it. Samuel began to fuss, his little face scrunching up in the way that heralded hunger. Ruth reached for him automatically. I should get him home for his feeding, she said, gathering their few belongings. Finn stood quickly, offering a hand to help her up. Ruth hesitated only briefly before accepting it. His palm was warm and calloused, his grip firm but gentle as he pulled her to her feet. Thank you for the company, Mrs. Olsen, he said, releasing her hand perhaps a moment longer than necessary. It's nice talking to someone who doesn't just see a drifting cowhand. The simple honesty in his statement resonated with something deep inside her. And thank you, Mr. Ironwood, for seeing a mother and her child, not a scandal with legs. His laugh was unexpected and rich, like coffee brewing over a campfire. Well put, madam, well put. As Ruth walked back toward town with Samuel cradled against her, she found herself smiling, a rare enough occurrence these days that it felt almost strange on her face. The following days established a pattern. Ruth would glimpse Finn around town at the mercantile, the bank, the land office. He'd tip his hat, sometimes stop for a brief conversation if she wasn't rushing to work. On Wednesday afternoon, when the dress shop closed early, she found him waiting outside with a small paper sack. Peppermint sticks, he explained, offering her the candy. Thought Samuel might like to gum on one. My ma used to give them to us when we were teething. The thoughtfulness of the gesture left Ruth momentarily speechless. That's very kind, she finally managed, accepting the small gift. His first tooth is just starting to come in. Finn nodded knowingly. Thought so, he was drooling something fierce yesterday. The fact that he'd noticed such a detail about her son made something warm unfurl in Ruth's chest, a feeling so foreign that she almost didn't recognize it as happiness. They fell into step together, walking toward the livery stable without discussion, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Found a piece of land I might buy, Finn said as they walked. About 5 miles out of town. Got a creek running through it, good pasture, and even a small cabin that wouldn't need too much work to be livable. Sounds perfect, Ruth replied, genuinely pleased for him. I'm going out tomorrow to look it over one more time before I make an offer, he continued. Would you? That is, if you're not working. He cleared his throat. Would you and Samuel like to come along? It's a fine day for a ride and I've got a wagon. Ruth stopped walking, surprised by the invitation. It was improper, of course, for a single woman to go riding alone with a man she barely knew. But then again, she was already a fallen woman in the eyes of Fort Worth. What was one more impropriety? I'd like that, she said, the words coming out before she could reconsider. I have Thursdays off from the shop. Finn's smile was like sunshine breaking through clouds. I'll come by around 9 if that suits. That night, as Ruth prepared for bed in her small room, she caught herself humming another thing she hadn't done in months. She should be more cautious, she knew. Men had ulterior motives. She'd learned that lesson the hard way with Samuel's father. Alan had been charming too, with his smooth words and promises of a future together. The son of a wealthy rancher passing through the town where she'd been working as a housemaid, he'd courted her secretly for weeks. When she discovered she was carrying his child, he disappeared, leaving her only a hastily scribbled note explaining that his family would never accept someone of her station, and that he was already promised to a girl back east. She touched her sleeping son's soft cheek. Despite everything, she couldn't regret Samuel's existence. But she could and would be wiser about men's intentions, yet something about Finn Ironwood seemed different. There was an openness to him, a lack of pretense that set him apart. Or perhaps she was simply fooling herself again. Thursday morning dawned clear and pleasantly warm for late spring. Ruth dressed with more care than usual, selecting her blue calico dress faded but clean and pinning her dark blonde hair in a simple but neat arrangement. She prepared Samuel with equal attention, dressing him in his best outfit and wrapping him in a clean blanket. Promptly at 9, there was a knock at her door. Ruth opened it to find Finn standing there, hat in hand, wearing a fresh shirt and what appeared to be newly polished boots. "Good morning, Mrs. Olsen," he said, his eyes taking in her appearance with obvious appreciation. "You look mighty fine today." Ruth felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Thank you. We're ready whenever you are." Finn had indeed secured a wagon, a serviceable if somewhat battered vehicle hitched to his chestnut mare, and a sturdy-looking gray gelding borrowed from the livery. "Let me," he said, reaching for Samuel as Ruth prepared to climb up to the seat. She hesitated only briefly before handing her son to him, watching as Finn cradled the baby with surprising confidence while she settled herself in the wagon. He then passed Samuel back to her before climbing up himself. "You seem comfortable with babies," Ruth observed as they set off, the wagon creaking beneath them. Finn clicked to the horses. "I'm the oldest of 6, helped raise all my brothers and sisters while Pa was working the farm and Ma was busy with the newest one." He glanced at her. "Samuel reminds me a bit of my youngest brother, Caleb. Same curious eyes." The image of a young Finn tending to his siblings made Ruth smile. It explained his easy manner with Samuel, who was currently settled contentedly in her lap, watching the passing scenery with wide eyes. They left Fort Worth behind, following a well-traveled road that eventually narrowed to little more than a track winding through rolling hills covered with spring wildflowers. The day was perfect warm sunshine, tempered by a gentle breeze that carried the scent of grass and distant rain. "It's beautiful out here," Ruth said, breathing deeply. After months confined mostly to town, the open country was intoxicating. "That it is," Finn agreed, though his eyes were on her rather than the landscape. They turned off the main track onto a narrower one that led through a stand of oak trees. As they emerged from the trees, Finn pulled the horses to a stop. "There it is," he said, gesturing to the valley below them. Ruth caught her breath. It was indeed a beautiful piece of land, a gentle slope leading down to a clear creek, good grass all around, and nestled against a small rise, a log cabin with a stone chimney. A few mature trees provided shade, and in the distance, hills rose blue against the horizon. "Oh, Finn," she said softly, forgetting formality in her admiration. "It's perfect." His smile was both pleased and a little shy. "You think so? Come on, let's take a closer look." He helped her down from the wagon, his hands strong and sure at her waist. Samuel squealed with delight at being carried down to this new place, his little hands reaching for everything as Ruth held him. They walked the property together, Finn pointing out features with obvious pride: the depth of the creek, the natural boundary formed by a rocky outcropping, the fertile soil in what could become a garden patch. The cabin, when they reached it, was simple but solidly built, with a main room containing a fireplace, a small bedroom, and a lean-to that could serve as a storage space. "It needs work," Finn acknowledged, running a hand along the rough-hewn door frame. "New chinking between the logs, a proper window or two, maybe a porch eventually." He glanced at her. "But it's sound." Ruth stepped inside, imagining the space with furnishings: a table by the window, a rocking chair near the fireplace, shelves for books and dishes. It was small but far more spacious than her rented room above the livery. "I think it's wonderful," she said honestly. "You could make a real home here." Something flickered in Finn's eyes at her words. "That's the plan," he said quietly. They had brought food, bread, cheese, apples, and a jar of sweet tea which they ate sitting on a fallen log near the creek. Samuel lay on a blanket beside them, happily kicking his legs in the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees. "What brought you to Fort Worth, Ruth?" Finn asked, using her given name for the first time. The question was gentle but direct. Ruth hesitated. She'd become accustomed to evading such inquiries, to keeping her past safely locked away. But something about this day, the open sky, the promise of the land around them, the way Finn looked at her as if her answer truly mattered, made her want to speak the truth. "I was running," she said finally. "From Alan Samuel's father, or rather, from the shame of being abandoned by him." She smoothed her skirt, not meeting Finn's eyes. "He was passing through the town where I worked as a housemaid, the son of a wealthy rancher, educated, charming. He courted me in secret for weeks, made promises." She shook her head. "When I told him I was expecting, he disappeared that night. Left a note saying his family would never accept someone like me, and that he was already promised to a girl back east." Finn's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. "I couldn't stay there with everyone knowing. So I traveled as far as my savings would take me, ending up here just before Samuel was born." She looked up at him finally. "And that's my scandalous story, Mr. Ironwood." "Finn," he corrected gently, "and there's no scandal in being betrayed by a coward." His voice was even, but there was steel beneath the words. "The scandal belongs to him, not you." The simple declaration, so at odds with everything society had taught her about her situation, made Ruth's eyes sting with unexpected tears. She blinked them away quickly. "What about you?" she asked, eager to shift the focus. "You mentioned the war. Did you fight?" Finn nodded, his gaze drifting to the middle distance. "Joined up in '61 when I was 18. Thought it would be a grand adventure." A humorless smile crossed his face. "It wasn't." "I'm sorry," Ruth said softly, understanding there were depths of experience there he might never share. "After it ended, I couldn't go back to the farm. Everything looked the same, but nothing felt the same, especially me." He shrugged. "So I drifted west, found work with cattle. Been doing that ever since." "Until now," Ruth observed. "What changed?" Finn looked at her directly. "Got tired of not belonging anywhere, I suppose. Started to wonder what I was running from." He paused. "Or maybe what I was running toward." There was something in his gaze that made Ruth's heart beat faster. She looked away, focusing on Samuel, who had fallen asleep on his blanket. "We should head back soon," she said. "It'll be getting warm, and Samuel will need his proper nap." Finn nodded, though she sensed a reluctance in him that matched her own. This day, this place, felt removed from the realities waiting for them in Fort Worth, a perfect moment she was loath to end. As they packed up their simple picnic, Finn's hand brushed against hers, the brief contact sending a tingle up her arm. She wondered if he'd felt it too, this strange electricity between them. The ride back to town was quieter, both lost in their thoughts, though the silence was comfortable rather than awkward. As they approached Fort Worth, Ruth felt reality settling back around her like a too-tight corset. Finn seemed to sense her changing mood. "Thank you for coming today," he said. "Seeing the place through your eyes, it helped me be sure." "You're going to buy it then?" Ruth asked. He nodded. "Going to the bank tomorrow to arrange it." He hesitated. "Would you mind if I come by to let you know how it goes?" "I'd like that," Ruth replied, surprised by how much she meant it. When they reached the livery stable, Finn helped her down from the wagon, his hands lingering at her waist a moment longer than necessary. He then carefully took Samuel from her, holding the sleeping baby while Ruth gathered their things. "He's a fine boy," Finn said softly, looking down at Samuel's peaceful face. "Any man would be proud to call him son." The words, spoken with such sincerity, made Ruth's throat tighten with emotion. She reached for Samuel, their arms brushing as Finn transferred the baby to her. "Thank you for today," she said, struggling to maintain her composure. It was lovely. Finn touched the brim of his hat. The pleasure was mine, Ruth, truly. As she climbed the stairs to her room, Ruth felt his eyes on her back. She didn't turn, afraid of what her face might reveal the growing feelings she could no longer deny, feelings that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. The following day at the dress shop, Ruth found it hard to concentrate on her work. Her mind kept drifting to the peaceful creek, the solid cabin, and most of all, to Finn's steady presence beside her. Mrs. Holloway had to remind her twice about an order for Mrs. Fulton's daughter, and she pricked her finger more than once while hemming a skirt. "You seem distracted today, Ruth," Mrs. Holloway observed during a quiet moment. "Is Samuel keeping you up at night?" "No, he's sleeping well," Ruth answered, bending over her work to hide the flush she felt rising in her cheeks. "Just a bit tired is all." Mrs. Holloway studied her with knowing eyes but said nothing more. The bell above the door jingled, and Ruth looked up to see Finn enter, hat in hand. He looked different, his hair trimmed, his face freshly shaved, wearing a new shirt beneath his familiar leather vest. "Afternoon, ladies," he said, nodding to Mrs. Holloway before his gaze settled on Ruth. "Mrs. Olsen, Mr. Ironwood," Ruth replied, setting aside her sewing. "What brings you to the dress shop?" he smiled, a hint of nervousness in his expression that she found endearing. "Wanted to let you know that the bank approved my loan. The land will be mine, papers signed tomorrow." "Congratulations," Ruth said warmly. "That's wonderful news, Mrs. Holloway looked between them with raised eyebrows. "You've purchased land near Fort Worth, Mr. Ironwood?" "Yes, madam, about 5 miles out toward the creek, planning to raise horses, maybe some cattle." He shifted his weight, hat twisting slightly in his hands. "Actually, Mrs. Holloway, I was hoping I might speak with Mrs. Olsen privately for a moment if you could spare her." Mrs. Holloway's eyebrows climbed higher. "Well, I suppose we can manage without her for a few minutes." She gave Ruth a look that clearly communicated her curiosity would need satisfying later. "Take your break now, Ruth?" "Thank you," Ruth said, untying her work apron and checking on Samuel, who was napping in his basket. "I'll just be outside," she told Mrs. Holloway, following Finn out the door. They stepped into the sunshine, moving a short distance from the shop entrance. Ruth was acutely aware of curious glances from passers-by. A woman like her speaking privately with a man would certainly fuel gossip. "Is everything all right?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Finn nodded, his expression serious. "More than all right. I wanted to ask you something, Ruth." He took a deep breath. "I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel, that is, I think we understand each other in ways that usually take much longer." Ruth's heart began to race, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "What are you asking, Finn?" "I've been alone a long time," he said simply. "So have you, in a different way. That land, it's more than I need just for myself. It's a place for a family." His eyes held her steadily. "I'm asking if you'd consider coming to see it again, maybe, regularly, to see if it might suit you and Samuel." Ruth stared at him, trying to process his meaning. "Are you courting me?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Trying to, though not very smoothly, it seems." "But you barely know me," she protested. "And Samuel, you know what people say about us." Finn's expression hardened slightly. "I don't much care what people say. I care about what I see: a strong, kind woman raising her boy with dignity despite everything. A woman I can't stop thinking about." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not offering charity, Ruth. I'm offering partnership, companionship. I think we could build something good together, if you're willing to consider it." Ruth felt dizzy with the unexpected turn of events. Part of her wanted to say yes immediately, to grasp this chance at a different life with both hands, but caution born of hard experience held her back. "I need time," she said finally. "This is unexpected." "Of course," Finn agreed readily. "Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." He hesitated. "Would you and Samuel join me for supper on Sunday at the hotel restaurant? Might give us a chance to talk more." A proper invitation to a public place. He was doing this properly, despite her circumstances. The consideration touched her deeply. "Yes," she said, "we'd like that." His smile was brilliant. "I'll come by for you at 6. As Ruth returned to the dress shop, her mind was spinning. Mrs. Holloway gave her a questioning look, but Ruth merely shook her head slightly, not ready to discuss what had just happened. The rest of the day passed in a blur, and that evening, as she put Samuel to bed, Ruth found herself talking to her son more than usual. "What do you think of Mr. Ironwood, Samuel?" she asked softly as the baby gazed up at her with drowsy eyes. "He seems to like you very much." She stroked his soft cheek. "And I think I might like him too, but it's not just me anymore, is it? It's us. We're a family, you and I." Samuel yawned in response, his eyelids fluttering closed. Ruth sat by the window long after he fell asleep, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The prospect of Finn's attention was both thrilling and terrifying. She'd trusted once before and been devastated. Could she risk her heart and Samuel's future again? Yet Finn was nothing like Alan. Where Alan had been smooth and polished, Finn was straightforward and genuine. Alan had courted her in secret. Finn had asked to court her openly, despite the damage to his own reputation it might cause. And most telling of all, Alan had fled responsibility, while Finn seemed to be offering to share hers. Sunday arrived both too quickly and not quickly enough. Ruth prepared for the evening with trembling hands, dressing Samuel in his cleanest clothes and herself in her one good dress, a deep green cotton with a lace collar she'd added herself. She brushed her hair until it shone, pinning it up in a style more elaborate than her usual practical arrangement. Finn arrived exactly at 6, looking so handsome in a clean dark shirt and vest that Ruth's breath caught in her throat. His eyes widened appreciatively when he saw her. "You look beautiful," he said simply. "Thank you," she replied, adjusting Samuel on her hip to hide her flustered reaction. "You look very nice yourself." The hotel restaurant was the finest establishment in Fort Worth, and Ruth felt nervous as they entered. She'd never dined there, and she was painfully aware of the stares they attracted the infamous unwed mother and the newcomer Cowboy, who had inexplicably taken an interest in her. But Finn seemed oblivious to the attention, guiding her to a table with a hand lightly at the small of her back. He held her chair, made sure she was settled comfortably with Samuel in her lap, and ordered for both of them with easy confidence. "People are staring," Ruth murmured, keeping her eyes on Samuel to avoid meeting the gazes she felt burning into her back. "Let them," Finn replied with a shrug. "They'll find something new to gossip about tomorrow." His unconcern was refreshing, though Ruth found it harder to ignore the whispers and looks. One voice, louder than the others, carried clearly to their table. "Shameless, absolutely shameless," said a woman Ruth recognized as Mrs. Peterson, the banker's wife. "First she parades that illegitimate child around town, and now she's ensnared some unsuspecting cowboy. I tell you, women like that are a danger to decent society." Ruth's face burned with humiliation. She looked down at Samuel, fighting back tears. Finn's expression darkened and he started to rise, but Ruth reached across the table to grasp his hand. "Please don't," she whispered. "It will only make things worse." He sat back down reluctantly, covering her hand with his. "You shouldn't have to hear such things," he said, his voice tight with anger. "I've heard worse," she admitted. "Usually I can ignore it." Their food arrived: tender roast beef, potatoes, and fresh green beans. It looked delicious, but Ruth found her appetite had disappeared. She focused on helping Samuel with small bits of potato instead. "Tell me about the land," she said, desperate to change the subject. "What will you do first?" Finn followed her lead, describing his plans for the cabin, the vegetable garden he wanted to plant, the corral he'd build for horses. His enthusiasm was infectious, and gradually, Ruth found herself relaxing, the cruel words receding as she lost herself in conversation with him. "I've been thinking about a porch," he was saying, "facing west to catch the sunset, wide enough for a couple of rocking chairs." The image was so domestic, so peaceful, that Ruth could see it clearly, the two of them sitting together in the evening, watching the sun go down while Samuel played at their feet. The longing it evoked was almost painful in its intensity. That sounds lovely, she said softly. Finn's eyes met hers. It does, doesn't it? The question held more meaning than the simple words conveyed. The moment was broken when Samuel began to fuss, overtired and overwhelmed by the unfamiliar surroundings. I should get him home, Ruth said, trying to soothe the increasingly agitated baby. Of course, Finn agreed, immediately signaling for the bill. Outside, the evening air had cooled and Ruth wrapped her shawl more tightly around herself and Samuel. The baby continued to cry, his little face red with distress. Here, let me, Finn said, reaching for Samuel. Ruth hesitated only briefly before handing him over. To her amazement, Finn tucked the baby against his shoulder and began to hum softly, a low, soothing melody that gradually calmed Samuel's cries. How did you do that? Ruth asked, watching in wonder as her son's eyes began to close, his small body relaxing against Finn's broad shoulder. Old trick my ma taught me, Finn replied with a smile. Works on colicky calves too, though don't tell Samuel I said that. Ruth laughed, the sound surprising her. When had she last truly laughed? They walked slowly back toward the livery, Finn still carrying Samuel. The streets were quieter now, most people at home for Sunday supper. In the fading light, with Finn beside her and her son peaceful in his arms, Ruth felt a sense of rightness she hadn't experienced in a very long time. At the foot of the stairs to her room, Finn gently transferred the now sleeping Samuel back to her. Their faces were close as they made the exchange, close enough that Ruth could see the flecks of gold in Finn's hazel eyes, could feel his breath warm against her cheek. Thank you for tonight, she said softly. My pleasure, he replied, his voice equally quiet. Ruth, I meant what I said the other day. I'd like to court you properly. I understand your caution, but I want you to know my intentions are honorable. She looked up at him, searching his face. Why me? You could court any respectable girl in town, start fresh without all this. She gestured vaguely at herself and Samuel. I don't want any girl in town, Finn said simply. I want you, both of you. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away and gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. I'll call on you tomorrow if that's all right. Ruth nodded, not trusting her voice. Good night then, he said, his fingers brushing her cheek briefly before he stepped back. Good night, Finn, she whispered. That night, as Ruth lay in bed with Samuel sleeping beside her, she allowed herself to hope for the first time in longer than she could remember. Hope was dangerous, she knew that all too well. But something about Finn Ironwood made her believe that perhaps, just this once, hope might not lead to heartbreak. True to his word, Finn came to see her the next day and the next, and the day after that. Sometimes they just talked for a few minutes when she was leaving work. Other times he'd walk with her and Samuel in the evenings, telling stories of his travels or asking about her day. On Saturday, he brought her a small potted geranium for her window. To brighten your room, he explained, looking almost shy as he handed it to her. Word of Finn's attention to Ruth spread quickly through Fort Worth. Some, like Mrs. Holloway, watched with quiet approval. Others were less kind. Never thought I'd see a man deliberately take up with a fallen woman, Ruth overheard Mr. Davidson saying to the blacksmith one morning. Must be something wrong with him. Or maybe he just sees something the rest of you are too blind to notice, replied the blacksmith, surprising Ruth with his defense. The following Sunday, Finn invited Ruth and Samuel to visit his new property again. The sale had been finalized and he'd already begun work on the cabin. I want to show you what I've done, he said, his excitement evident. And maybe get your thoughts on a few things. The changes were indeed impressive. He'd repaired the roof, replaced the door, and added a proper window to let in more light. Inside, he'd rebuilt the fireplace, laying new stones and fixing the chimney so it would draw properly. The walls had been chinked with fresh mud and straw, and the dirt floor had been swept clean, ready for the wooden planks he'd stacked nearby. Finn, this is remarkable, Ruth said, walking around the cabin while Samuel crawled happily on a blanket Finn had spread on the floor. You've done all this in a week. Hired some help for the bigger jobs, he admitted. But yes, been working from sunup to sundown. He watched her face anxiously. Do you like it? The question seemed to hold more weight than a simple request for approval of his renovations. Ruth met his gaze steadily. I do, very much. His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. There's something else I want to show you. He led her outside to where a small wooden structure stood a short distance from the main cabin. It's not much yet, he said as they approached, but I thought, for Samuel, a place of his own someday when he's older, connected to the main cabin by a covered walkway maybe. Ruth stared at the small room, roughly framed but already taking shape. The foundation was solid, the walls halfway built. It was a boy's room, a son's room planned with care and built with hope. You did this for Samuel? She asked, her voice catching. Finn nodded. I know he's got his ma, and that's more than enough, but every boy should have a place of his own and someone to teach him to fish and ride and… He trailed off, suddenly uncertain. If you'll have me, that is. Ruth felt tears fill her eyes. No one, not even Alan in his most charming moments, had ever considered Samuel's future so thoughtfully, had ever seen him as more than a burden or a mistake. Finn, she began, but words failed her. He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. I've been thinking about this all wrong, he said quietly. Asking to court you, taking things slow, it's not what either of us needs. He took a deep breath. Ruth Olsen, I love you. I think I've loved you since I first saw you walking down the street, head held high despite everything. I love your courage, your kindness, your determination, and I love that boy of yours like he was my own already. Ruth couldn't speak, her throat too tight with emotion. I'm asking you to marry me, Finn continued. Not someday, not after a proper courtship, but soon, next week if you're willing. Be my wife, Ruth. Let me be a father to Samuel. Let's build a life here together. A tear slipped down Ruth's cheek. Finn, are you sure? The talk, the gossip, it will follow us. People will say you married another man's leavings, that Samuel isn't yours. Let them talk, Finn said firmly. Samuel will be mine in every way that matters, and you, his voice softened, you would be my heart, Ruth, if you'll have me. Ruth looked at the small room he'd begun building for her son, at the cabin he was transforming into a home, and finally at the man standing before her with his heart in his eyes. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I'll marry you. Finn's face broke into a smile of such joy that Ruth felt her heart might burst. He drew her into his arms, holding her as if she were precious beyond measure. When he lowered his head to kiss her, Ruth met him halfway, her arms winding around his neck as their lips met for the first time. The kiss was gentle at first, almost reverent, but quickly deepened into something that made Ruth's knees weak and her heart race. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Finn rested his forehead against hers. I've been wanting to do that since the first time I saw you, he admitted, his voice husky. Ruth smiled. I'm glad you finally did. They returned to the cabin to find Samuel had fallen asleep on his blanket. Finn knelt beside the baby, his expression tender as he looked at the sleeping child. He's going to need a proper bed, he said. I've started carving one, nothing fancy but sturdy. Ruth touched his shoulder. You've thought of everything? Not everything, Finn replied, looking up at her. There's the wedding to plan. I thought we might ask Reverend Parker to perform the ceremony here at the cabin, just us and a few witnesses, unless you'd prefer something in town. The thought of a quiet ceremony, away from the judgmental eyes of Fort Worth, was appealing. Here would be perfect, Ruth agreed. But Finn, are you sure you want to do this so quickly? People will talk. Let them, he said, rising to stand before her. I've waited long enough for a family, Ruth. I don't aim to wait any longer than necessary. His words warmed her from within. Family. Such a simple word, yet it held everything she'd ever wanted. Next Saturday, then, she said decisively. That will give us time to prepare the cabin and get a license. Finn's smile was brilliant. Next Saturday it is. The week that followed passed in a whirlwind of activity. Ruth gave notice at the dress shop, and to her surprise, Mrs. Holloway seemed genuinely happy for her. He's a good man, that Mr. Ironwood, the older woman said. I can tell by the way he looks at you and at Samuel." Word of their engagement spread quickly through Fort Worth, with reactions ranging from congratulatory to openly disapproving. Ruth tried to ignore the whispers and stares, focusing instead on the future that awaited her with Finn. They decided on a simple ceremony with just a few witnesses, Mrs. Holloway, Mr. Jenkins from the livery, and the blacksmith, who had become something of an ally. Finn rode into town each day to work on the cabin, returning in the evenings to spend time with Ruth and Samuel, often bringing small gifts, a wooden toy he'd carved, wildflowers gathered from the property, once a length of pretty fabric for curtains. On Thursday, Ruth was packing her few belongings when there was a knock at her door. She opened it to find not Finn, but a well-dressed woman she'd never seen before. "Mrs. Olsen?" the woman asked, her voice clipped and formal. "Yes," Ruth answered cautiously. "My name is Margaret Thornton. I believe you are planning to marry Finn Ironwood this Saturday." Ruth's stomach tightened with apprehension. "That's right. May I come in? I have something important to discuss with you." Reluctantly, Ruth stepped aside, allowing the woman to enter her small room. Samuel was napping in his makeshift crib, and Mrs. Thornton's gaze lingered on him briefly before returning to Ruth. "I'll be direct, Mrs. Olsen. I am concerned about Finnegan's hasty decision to marry you. He is a dear family friend, and I worry he is not thinking clearly." "I see," Ruth said, struggling to keep her voice even. "And why would that be?" Mrs. Thornton's expression softened slightly. "I mean no personal offense. I understand your situation is difficult, but Finnegan comes from a respectable family. His father was a prominent farmer in Missouri, and his mother still maintains connections there. This marriage to a woman with a child born out of wedlock would cause considerable distress to his family." Each word struck Ruth like a physical blow, but she refused to show weakness. "Have you discussed this with Finn?" "Not yet. I thought it more appropriate to speak with you first. Perhaps if you were to reconsider this arrangement, it would spare everyone considerable pain." Ruth took a deep breath, steadying herself. "Mrs. Thornton, I appreciate your concern for Finn's welfare, but he has asked me to marry him, and I have accepted. If he has concerns about his family's reaction, that is for him to discuss with me." The woman's face hardened. "You must understand how this appears. A woman in your position, suddenly engaged to a man who has just purchased property. Some might call it opportunistic." The implication stung, but Ruth held her ground. "What some might call it is of no concern to me, Mrs. Thornton. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have packing to finish." Mrs. Thornton rose stiffly. "I see there's no reasoning with you. I had hoped to resolve this quietly, but I'll be forced to speak with Finnegan directly." "That is your right," Ruth replied, moving to open the door. "Good day, Mrs. Thornton." After the woman left, Ruth sat heavily on the edge of her bed, trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Who was this woman, and how much influence did she have over Finn? Would her words make him reconsider his proposal? She was still sitting there when Finn arrived an hour later, his smile fading quickly when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" he asked, crossing to kneel before her. "Ruth, what's happened?" "A Mrs. Thornton came to see me," Ruth said, watching his face carefully. "She said she's a family friend of yours." Finn's expression darkened. "Margaret Thornton, what did she want?" Ruth told him about the visit, trying to keep her voice steady as she recounted the woman's words. Finn's jaw tightened as he listened, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. "I'm sorry she came here," he said when Ruth finished. "Margaret was a friend of my mother's. She moved to Fort Worth a few years ago after her husband died. I had no idea she was here until I ran into her at the bank last week." He shook his head. "She had no right to speak to you like that." "She seemed to think she was protecting you," Ruth said quietly. "And maybe she's right, Finn. Maybe you haven't thought this through. Your family, my family, will love you," Finn interrupted firmly. "And they'll adore Samuel. My mother had me out of wedlock, Ruth." "Did Margaret conveniently forget to mention that?" Ruth stared at him in shock. "What?" Finn nodded grimly. Pa wasn't my biological father. He married Ma when I was 3 months old, gave me his name, raised me as his own. No one ever treated me any differently than my brothers and sisters who came later. He took Ruth's hands in his. So you see, Margaret's concern is not only unwelcome, it's hypocritical. Relief washed over Ruth. You never told me that. It never seemed important, Finn shrugged. Pa was my father in every way that mattered, just like I'll be Samuel's father. He squeezed her hands. Nothing has changed, Ruth. I still want to marry you on Saturday unless you've changed your mind. No, she said firmly. I haven't changed my mind. Finn smiled, the tension leaving his shoulders. Good. Because I've finished the porch and I've been thinking we might want to plant some roses along the south side of the cabin. Red ones, like that ribbon you wear in your hair sometimes. His easy shift back to their future together, his absolute certainty, dissolved the last of Ruth's doubts. She leaned forward to kiss him, pouring all her relief and love into the gesture. I love you, Finn Ironwood, she whispered against his lips. And I love you, Ruth Olsen, he replied. Soon to be Ruth Ironwood. Saturday dawned clear and beautiful, as if nature itself approved of their union. Finn had stayed in town the night before, adhering to tradition even in their unconventional circumstances. He sent word that he would meet her at the cabin at noon, and that everything was ready. Ruth dressed carefully in her best dress, the green one Finn admired with a sprig of wildflowers pinned to her bodice. She dressed Samuel in the new outfit Mrs. Holloway had sewn for him as a gift, a tiny suit that made him look impossibly grown up and adorable at the same time. Mr. Jenkins drove them out to the property in his wagon, along with Mrs. Holloway, who fussed over Ruth's hair and Samuel's collar the entire journey. Never thought I'd see you settled so well, the older woman admitted as they neared the cabin. That man looks at you like you hung the moon, Ruth, and the way he is with Samuel, it's a blessing, pure and simple. Ruth smiled, holding Samuel close. Yes, she agreed, it is. As they crested the hill and the cabin came into view, Ruth gasped. Finn had been busy. The porch he'd promised was complete, with 2 rocking chairs sitting side by side. Wildflowers had been planted along the walkway, and a small vegetable garden had been started to one side. But most striking of all was the sign hanging beside the door, Ironwood, carved in bold letters, with space beneath it that Ruth realized was meant for their first names. Finn was waiting for them, dressed in new clothes, his hair neatly trimmed, his face freshly shaved. Beside him stood Reverend Parker from the Fort Worth Church, and to Ruth's surprise, the blacksmith and his wife. As Mr. Jenkins helped her down from the wagon, Finn approached, his eyes never leaving her face. You look beautiful, he said softly. So do you, Ruth replied, smiling through sudden tears. Finn reached for Samuel, who went to him readily, little hands immediately grabbing for Finn's collar. And you, young man, look very handsome indeed, he said, making the baby giggle. They moved to the porch, where Reverend Parker had set up a small table with a Bible. The ceremony was simple and brief, but no less meaningful for its simplicity. Ruth felt a profound sense of rightness as she spoke her vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish the man before her. When Finn repeated his own vows, his voice was steady and sure, his eyes never leaving hers. I, Finnegan James Ironwood, take you, Ruth Elizabeth Olsen, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love and cherish you and your son as my own family, to protect and provide for you both, to be faithful and true for as long as we both shall live. By the power vested in me, Reverend Parker concluded, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Finn leaned forward, one arm still securely holding Samuel, the other gently cradling Ruth's cheek as he kissed her. It was a tender kiss, full of promise and love, and when they parted, Ruth saw her own joy reflected in his eyes. Mrs. Ironwood, he said softly, testing the name. Ruth smiled. Mr. Ironwood. Samuel babbled happily between them, his small hand patting Finn's cheek as if in approval. Their small group of witnesses offered congratulations and shared a simple meal Finn had prepared. There was laughter and conversation, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Ruth felt completely at ease, accepted without judgment or whispers. As evening approached, their guests prepared to leave, Mr. Jenkins offering to drive everyone back to town. "You've made a fine start here," the blacksmith told Finn, clasping his hand firmly. "If you need any ironwork done, you come see me, special rates for neighbors." "I appreciate that," Finn replied, smiling. Mrs. Holloway hugged Ruth tightly. "Be happy," she whispered. "You deserve it." When they were finally alone, Finn took Ruth's hand, leading her back to the porch. Samuel had fallen asleep, worn out from the excitement, and Finn had carefully laid him on a small pallet inside the cabin, visible through the open door. "Welcome home," Finn said, drawing Ruth into his arms. She leaned against him, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "It's perfect," she murmured. "Not quite," Finn replied. "There's still a lot to do. The garden needs expanding, Samuel's room needs finishing, and I thought maybe we might add another room someday." He hesitated. "For more children if you wanted." Ruth looked up at him, her heart full to bursting. "I would like that very much." Finn's smile was tender as he bent to kiss her again, this time with a deepening passion that promised much more to come. "I love you, Ruth Ironwood," he whispered against her lips. "And I love you, Finnegan Ironwood," she replied. "Thank you for seeing me, really seeing me when no one else would. I'll never stop," he promised. As darkness fell, they sat together in the rocking chairs on their porch, Samuel sleeping peacefully inside, the first stars appearing in the vast Texas sky. Ruth leaned her head against Finn's shoulder, his arm warm around her waist, and knew with absolute certainty that she was, at last, exactly where she belonged. 5 years later, the sound of laughter drifted through the open windows of the Ironwood home, no longer a simple cabin, but a proper house with 4 rooms, glass windows, and the promised wide porch with 2 rocking chairs. Ruth stood in the kitchen, kneading bread dough while watching through the window as Finn taught 6-year-old Samuel to throw a lasso. The boy's face was a study in concentration, his tongue caught between his teeth as he tried to mimic his father's movements. "Like this, Pa?" Samuel asked, swinging the small rope in a wobbly circle. "That's it," Finn encouraged. "Now aim for the post just like I showed you." Ruth smiled as she watched them, her heart full of the quiet joy that had become the foundation of their lives. Samuel had started calling Finn Pa shortly after their wedding, and Finn had signed the adoption papers on the boy's first birthday, making official what was already true in their hearts. A small cry from the cradle in the corner of the kitchen drew Ruth's attention. She wiped her hands on her apron and moved to lift her daughter, Elizabeth Margaret Ironwood, born just 2 months earlier. The baby's eyes, the same hazel as her father's, blinked up at Ruth as she settled against her mother's shoulder. "There now," Ruth murmured, patting the infant's back. "Wanting to see what your brother and Papa are doing, are you?" She carried Elizabeth to the porch, settling in one of the rocking chairs to nurse her. From here, she had a perfect view of the ranch yard, where Finn was now helping Samuel adjust his grip on the lasso. The property had flourished under Finn's care. What had started as a simple cabin by a creek was now a modest but successful horse ranch, with a barn, corral, and several fenced pastures where a dozen fine horses grazed. "Mama, look." Samuel called, successfully looping his small lasso around the post. "I did it?" "Well done," Ruth called back, beaming with pride. Finn ruffled Samuel's dark blonde hair so like Ruth's own and looked up at his wife with a smile that still made her heart skip a beat. 5 years of marriage had only deepened the bond between them, each challenge and joy they'd faced together strengthening their foundation. There had been challenges, of course. Finn's mother had initially been hesitant about his hasty marriage, though she'd quickly fallen in love with Ruth and Samuel upon visiting from Missouri. The townspeople of Fort Worth had gossiped for a time, but gradually, as the Ironwoods proved themselves hardworking and respectable members of the community, the whispers had faded. Now, they were simply the family at the Creekside Ranch who bred the best quarter horses in the county, whose boy was starting school in the fall, whose new baby girl had been christened at the church in town with half the congregation in attendance. Finn approached the porch, Samuel proudly trotting at his side. "Look at this cowboy," he said, his hand resting on the boy's shoulder. "He'll be out roping me by next summer." "I'm going to be just like Pa," Samuel declared with the absolute certainty of childhood. Ruth smiled. "You already are in many ways," she said softly. The bond between Finn and Samuel had grown so strong that sometimes it was hard to remember they didn't share blood. In every way that mattered, they were father and son. Finn leaned down to kiss Ruth, then placed a gentle finger on Elizabeth's cheek as she nursed. "How are my girls doing?" "We're perfect," Ruth replied, meaning it. "Just watching my favorite cowboys." Samuel climbed onto the porch and peered at his sister. "When will she be big enough to learn to rope?" Finn laughed. "Not for a while yet, son, but I bet she'll be just as good at it as you are." "I'll teach her," Samuel offered seriously, "since I'll be the expert by then." "That's very kind of you," Ruth said, adjusting Elizabeth as she finished nursing. Finn settled into the rocking chair beside Ruth's, drawing Samuel onto his lap. The boy was getting too big for such treatment, but he still loved to sit with his father, especially for the stories Finn would tell of his days driving cattle or fighting in the war, carefully edited versions. Of course, appropriate for young ears. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Ruth looked at her family, her son snuggled against his father's chest, her daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, her husband watching the sunset with contentment etched in every line of his face, and marveled at the journey that had brought them here. She remembered the whispers that had followed her in Fort Worth, the cruel judgments, the day Finn had knelt before Samuel and declared his intention to be the boy's father. From that moment, everything had changed. Where once there had been shame and isolation, now there was pride and belonging. "Penny for your thoughts," Finn said quietly, reaching across the space between their chairs to take her hand. Ruth smiled, squeezing his fingers. "I was just thinking how fortunate we are." Finn's eyes, warm in the fading light, held hers. "Not fortune, Ruth. We built this together. Every day with every choice we've made." Samuel yawned against Finn's chest, his eyelids drooping as the excitement of the day caught up with him. "Time for bed, cowboy," Finn said, standing with the boy in his arms. "Say good night to your mama and sister." "Night, mama." "Night, Lizzie," Samuel mumbled sleepily, using the nickname he'd given his sister. Ruth leaned over to kiss his forehead. "Sweet dreams, my love." She watched as Finn carried Samuel inside to the room he'd built for the boy all those years ago, now decorated with ropes, a small saddle, and drawings of horses Samuel had made. The room connected to the main house by the covered walkway Finn had envisioned, giving the boy his own space while keeping him close. Ruth rocked gently, holding Elizabeth close as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. In a few minutes, Finn would return, and they would sit together as they did each evening, talking about their day, making plans for tomorrow, sharing the comfortable silence of two people who had found their home in each other. 5 years ago, she had walked the streets of Fort Worth with her head down, shamed by the whispers that followed her. Now she walked with her head high, her husband at her side, her children both born of her body, but equally born of love, a testament to the family they had created. In the distance, a coyote called, its lonely cry echoing across the Texas plain. But here, on this porch, in this home they had built together, there was no loneliness, only the quiet, enduring love of a family that had found each other against all odds. Ruth smiled as she heard Finn's footsteps returning. "Yes," she thought, "we built this together, and it is more than I ever dared to hope for."